This is the most educated generation in human history. They speak multiple languages, navigate global job markets, and work longer hours than their parents ever did. And yet, in many of the world's major cities, even a stable, full-time income places homeownership somewhere between a distant dream and a mathematical impossibility. In London or Toronto, a modest apartment costs 20, sometimes 30 years of earnings. In Hong Kong, it is closer to 40. At night, half the windows in some luxury towers stay dark, bought as investments, not as homes, while just a few train stops away. Young families squeeze into units smaller than a parking space. How did a basic human need become a financial game that most humans can no longer win? And perhaps more importantly, who designed the rules of this game? Follow the story, and the system behind it may surprise you. To understand why housing has become the economic crisis of a generation, we need to step back into a world that no longer exists. A world in which homeownership wasn't just possible, it was expected. After World War II, entire nations built their middle classes around the promise of affordable homes. Governments subsidized mortgages and funded large-scale housing projects. Cities expanded outward into suburbs connected by new highways. In the United States, the 30-year fixed mortgage became an institution. In Europe, public housing was seen as infrastructure, much like schools or hospitals. Owning a home wasn't a speculative ambition. It was a milestone of adulthood, a foundation for family life, and evidence that the economic system worked for ordinary people. For decades, this model held strong. Real wages grew steadily. Construction kept up with population growth. And critically, land, though finite, had not yet become the globally traded asset it is today. But somewhere between the inflation shocks of the 1970s, the deregulation wave of the 1980s, and the global financial innovations of the 1990s, the relationship between income and housing prices began to fracture. What used to be 3 or 4 years of earnings slowly crept to 7, then 10. In some cities, it broke entirely. While wages flattened, asset prices, fueled by credit expansion, falling interest rates, and the rise of global finance, surged upward like an escalator that never stops. The gap between income and housing became not just a measure of affordability, but a window into the deeper transformations reshaping modern capitalism. The first major change was cultural, but it was reinforced by policy. As homeownership grew, politicians realized something important. Homeowners vote. And they tend to vote for policies that protect and ideally increase the value of their homes. In many democracies, this group became one of the most powerful political blocs. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a simple dynamic. When a large share of the electorate owns property, entire systems adapt to preserve property values. Mortgages became easier to get. Tax deductions favored homeowners. Zoning laws, initially designed for health and safety, turned into tools to limit housing supply, often at the request of the very communities that benefited from scarcity. Over time, the political logic became self-reinforcing. Homeownership creates wealth, and wealth defends homeownership. But the second transformation was even more consequential. Housing became financialized. That word can feel abstract, so imagine it visually. A small suburban home in the 1950s was a place to live, a way to store savings, maybe something to pass on to your children. By the early 2000s, it had become something else, collateral that could be sliced, repackaged, and sold in global financial markets. A house was still a home, but it was also a mortgage-backed security. A rental tower was still a building, but it was also a financial product sought by hedge funds, REITs, and overseas investors looking for safe returns. Two things made this transformation possible. The first was credit. From the 1980s through the 2010s, interest rates trended downward across advanced economies. Cheaper borrowing meant households could take on larger mortgages. This increased demand. Higher demand pushed prices up. Rising prices were taken as evidence of market strength, which encouraged more lending. The cycle repeated. The second driver was global capital. In a world with volatile markets and uncertain geopolitics, housing in stable cities became an extremely attractive store of value. A condo in Sydney or Vancouver wasn't just an apartment. It was a long-term bet on a safe and growing city. To many investors, whether anyone actually lived in the unit was irrelevant. This is how we entered the era of the dark towers, glittering high-rise buildings with immaculate lobbies and empty hallways. Developers marketed units not to local residents, but to foreign buyers, institutions, and speculators. Entire floors were purchased in cash. Lights stayed off at night. Meanwhile, a few kilometers away, young families competed for cramped rentals where rent consumed half their income. The contrast was jarring. A city with too many houses, but not enough homes. It would be easy to blame investors alone, but the system is more intricate and more uncomfortable than that. Consider zoning laws. In many wealthy neighborhoods, it is illegal to build anything other than a single-family home. Height limits restrict new apartment blocks. Density rules ban duplexes and triplexes. Parking requirements raise construction costs. On paper, these regulations protect community character. In practice, they restrict supply so effectively that even massive demand cannot be met. Politicians know this. Economists know this. Homeowners know this. But in many democracies, homeowners are the majority, and supply restrictions keep their property values high. Reforming zoning is politically explosive because it touches on the one thing many households fear losing, their primary source of wealth. We arrive, then, at the core tension. Housing is treated simultaneously as a human necessity and as the cornerstone of middle-class wealth. The more housing is protected as an investment, the less accessible it becomes as shelter. Governments try to address affordability by offering subsidies to first-time buyers, but these subsidies often backfire. When more people can bid on the same limited number of homes, prices rise again. The system treats symptoms without touching the underlying cause, supply restrictions and financial incentives that reward scarcity. If this were merely a story of market distortion, it would be frustrating but manageable. But the real-world consequences are far deeper and far more human. In cities like Seoul, young couples delay marriage because housing costs make family formation unrealistic. In San Francisco, essential workers live hours away, commuting early in the morning and returning late at night. In Hong Kong, subdivided cage homes represent one of the starkest images of urban inequality anywhere on Earth. In London, entire neighborhoods hollow out as long-time residents are priced out, while luxury developments rise along the Thames. These are not isolated tragedies. They are structural outcomes of an economic model that prioritizes the wealth effect over the welfare of future generations. And what of those future generations? Sociologists call today's young adults the downwardly mobile generation, not because they lack skills or ambition, but because the ladder they were promised no longer reaches the same height. Homeownership once served as the entry point into economic stability. Without it, entire life trajectories shift. People have fewer children, and later, they save less. They take fewer risks. They feel more anxious about the future. In political terms, they become disillusioned with institutions that seem unwilling or unable to fix the system. Housing, it turns out, is not just an economic variable. It is a cornerstone of social cohesion. But if this is the crisis, what does the alternative look like? For that, we turn to the cities that broke the pattern. Consider Vienna. More than half of all residents live in social or cooperative housing. These units are high quality, well located, and crucially, shielded from speculation. Rents are stable because supply is abundant. Singapore built a different model, but with similar results. Large-scale public development, long-term leases, and integrated planning ensured that homeownership remained achievable for most citizens. Tokyo took another approach. It made building easier. Zoning is flexible, approvals are rapid, and developers are allowed, even encouraged, to increase density. As a result, Tokyo builds far more housing each year than New York or London, even though its population is aging and shrinking. The outcome is clear. When supply is allowed to grow, prices moderate. These examples matter because they show that the crisis is not inevitable. It is constructed through policies, incentives, and choices. And what is constructed can be reconstructed. But any path forward requires confronting the uncomfortable truth that many voters, institutions, and governments have benefited from rising housing prices. In some countries, up to 70% of household wealth is tied to real estate. A dramatic fall in prices, even if it improves affordability, could destabilize the entire economy. This creates a paradox. The system cannot continue as it is, but changing, it risks undermining the very foundation on which the middle class has built its prosperity. So where do we go from here? Some advocate for sweeping zoning reform, legalizing multifamily housing, reducing parking mandates, and removing arbitrary height limits. Others prioritize taxing vacant homes, foreign buyers, or speculative investment. Still others argue for massive public investment in social and cooperative housing, treating it not as welfare but as essential infrastructure. There is no single solution, and each comes with trade-offs. But doing nothing, letting the escalator rise indefinitely, leads to a future in which homeownership becomes an inherited privilege rather than an earned achievement. The next decade will determine the direction. Demographic shifts, climate pressures, remote work, and political realignments will all reshape the housing landscape. We may see a correction in overheated markets. We may see bold reforms in cities where public frustration reaches a breaking point. Or we may see a slow continuation of the status quo, where affordability declines further and inequality hardens. The question each society must confront is simple, yet profound. Is housing primarily a financial asset or a human right? As this documentary draws to a close, consider the people who inhabit this story. The nurse who wakes up at 4 a.m. to begin her long commute. The couple who postponed starting a family because they cannot secure a stable place to live. The elderly homeowner whose entire retirement depends on the value of her home. The young professional scrolling through listings, silently calculating the impossible. These individuals are not characters in a theoretical model. They are the human faces of a system in transition. Housing reveals what we value as a society. Do we value stability enough to build it? Do we value community enough to allow density? Do we value opportunity enough to rethink zoning and incentives? The crisis before us is not merely economic. It is moral. It asks whether we are willing to design a world in which future generations can stand on the same foundation that previous generations enjoyed. And so we return to the opening question. How did the most educated generation in history become the least likely to own a home? The answer lies in decades of policies, market forces, and collective choices. But the future, unlike the past, has not yet been written. If there is one message to carry forward, it is this: the housing system we live in is not a natural law. It is a design, and designs can change. The next chapter belongs to the people who decide that a home should once again be a place to live, not a financial trophy. It belongs to the cities that choose abundance over scarcity, inclusion over exclusion, and long-term stability over short-term gains. And perhaps it belongs to the generation that refuses to accept that the dream of having a home is something they were never meant to reach.